Hi, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt, and welcome to Religion and Life. Our guest this week is Dr. Neva Spake, whose scholarly work ranges from the history of the Blue Ridge Parkway to pirates and to the lives of women in the historic Society of Friends communities. The Friends are better known as Quakers. Welcome, Neva.
Thanks, Ozzie.
Well, Neva, in addition to being the Senior Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences here, you're really quite a historian and have written about some very interesting topics. And I want to get to the Quakers. It has some national and North Carolina interest. But first, if you would just say a little bit about your Parkway, Blue Ridge Parkway work, because it has some real regional focus for us here.
So I didn't really know much about the Parkway when I moved here. In fact, I lived very close to the Parkway and just thought of it sort of as a road. And I had an opportunity to work on the Cone Estate, which is on the Parkway, and that's the home of Moses and Bertha Cone. They built a house up in the mountains near Blowing Rock, and it was they were involved in textiles and a lot of other things. And so I had a chance to learn about the furnishings of that house through a class I was teaching, and one thing led to another, and I became very involved in Parkway history. And you know, I learned a lot more about it. It's 469 miles long. It goes through Virginia and North Carolina, and there's just a lot more. We used to say it's not just a road. It's know it's a lot more to that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it was a New Deal project, I think.
It started off that way, yeah, absolutely. And it started being built in 1935, and they built it in sections, but the last section wasn't finished until 1987.
Right.
And it's the section that's closest to Grandfather Mountain for people who know where that is. That viaduct there, that was a great accomplishment, and it's a great place to go and visit.
Well, it really is a national treasure.
Yeah, it really is.
And your work with the Cone Manor House is interesting. Maybe you could tell us, I think there's a ghost story or two maybe that you
that's what everybody wants to talk about, right? Yeah, so Moses and Bertha built it in the turn of the 20th century, so around 1900. And the thing that's kind of sad is Moses only lived there until 1908. He died very young, and so Bertha continued to live there until the 1940s. And then the estate was given over first to a hospital. It was the Cone Hospital, were the executors, and they didn't want to have to manage it, and so they gave it eventually to the Park Service, who was looking for places along the Parkway to have as recreational areas. So when she died, she gave away all the furnishings in the house, and so it became just this empty building. And so downstairs, of course, is a gift shop, and upstairs is sort of this just empty space. And one of the things that, one of the ghost stories is there were some workers working on the porch outside. They had gone outside to paint and finish the roof, and there was a ranger there that day, and she came up and she heard these guys yelling, "Let us in, let us in." And she's like, "What?" And they were giving her a hard time. They said she'd locked them out. And she said, "Well, I just got here. Nobody's been in this house." And so they figured that somebody had must have
a little mischievous
ghost, yeah.
Okay, well, that's fascinating. So there's another item in your research that has North Carolina history written all over it, and that's your work with the Society of Friends, the Quakers. And I know you maybe haven't worked specifically with North Carolina Quakers, but the area down around Guilford County is a famous Quaker settlement. So introduce us to this religious group, the Society of Friends. Where do they come from, and what do they believe? So you have to kind of go back quite a ways to the 1640s to England, and there was an English Civil War between the Puritans were fighting against the Crown. And that time there's a lot of, it's during the time of the Reformation following up, and so there's a lot of people who want to move away from the Catholic Church into a religion where it's more shared belief with the congregation as well as the people who are leading a service. And some of the most radicals of those believers broke into different kinds of sects, and one of those becomes the Quakers, and they're really interested in not giving much credence to the biblical texts, but to actually self-revelation, so that they look at that everybody has a bit of light in them, or they talked about a flame sometimes that needs to be tended to. And so they believe that if you had a group of people who got together and they believed that God would speak through them,
And so they began having meetings where they would sit in silence waiting for somebody in the group to be moved to speak from the heart, which in their case was the spirit of God or Christ. The leader emerges from that group is a guy named George Fox. And
was he an English Puritan?
He was an English Puritan.
I think we have a image of George Fox that we can maybe look at while you talk here.
And so he was a young man, and he wasn't from a wealthy family, and he was really kind of a searcher. He was trying to figure out, about his spirituality, and so he became interested during the Civil War, I think, in some of these groups who were being, more radical, what we call radical compared to the orthodoxy of the day. And eventually, he writes a journal that becomes very famous about his beliefs. He goes kind of on a, equivalent of a 40-day time in the desert to discover this. And so he becomes really the founder of Quakerism in the 1640s, late 1640s. And then he comes in contact with lots of people, but one in particular, Margaret Fell, who's a very wealthy person, lives, her and her husband are landed gentry. And she becomes interested in Quakerism as well. And so she offers him kind of her estate as headquarters, and then they travel around.
We're still in England.
Still in England, yes, exactly. Right. As they become more popular, like the orthodoxy, the folks who are worried about them start to discriminate against them and oppress them, and they put anybody who's considered Quaker, they put in jail, or they charge them fines and things like that. So eventually, by the 1680s, they've become quite an organization in England and persecuted. And so William Penn, who's probably the person that most people have heard about in terms of Quakers, his father had a close relationship with the crown. And eventually, when the king is reinstated, he gets land. His son gets the land, William Penn, and it's an estate in the colonies. And so that becomes what is now Pennsylvania. Right. And so he's able to then open that up to Quakers who are being persecuted in England to come and set up shop here in the States.
Yeah, and Pennsylvania was a haven for all sorts of religious dissenters, not just
exactly.
Quakers,
so right? It's kind of known as the Holy Experiment, but the idea was that Penn believed that everybody was entitled to come and be able to believe what they wanted to believe.
So that's really, I guess that's why Quakers were feared. When you start moving the locus of authority away from the institution, away from the text, and center it in the personal experience, and you've really got a recipe, I guess, for chaos, right?
Correct. And some of the things, to move away from that orthodoxy, they believed in equality for all, because if you believe that everybody has a little bit of light in you, then you believe that everybody has to be equal. They believed, because of that equality, they didn't believe in using titles for people, so they used first names. They wouldn't give their betters, they wouldn't tip their hat to them. They might not, they used a personal pronoun instead of a formal pronoun, those kinds of things.
Yeah. Also, the idea that the divine is within leads to these questions of equality, or the idea of equality, led to their pacifistic beliefs. And I know one of the characteristic beliefs is pacifism and cooperation. Is that correct?
Yeah. So when they would come together and gather what we would call a congregation, or they called it a meeting, and when they come together at those meetings to make decisions, they had to come to a consensus. So, and you can imagine, if you have in a personal life, if you had to get a group of people together and try to agree on something, it might take a long time. And it was the same for the Quakers. They believed in consensus, but it didn't come easily. And so that's one of the things that they would do.
We've got a beautiful image here of a painting that I think many people will recognize. It's called the Peaceable Kingdom. Yeah. And I've always viewed that as a kind of utopian vision of America. But it's actually painted by a Quaker artist, is that correct? And maybe there's more to it than just this kind of utopian ideal. Right.
So if you look at the image, you've got what we would normally think as competitive animals, right? So lions and sheep and those kinds of things. And so what Edward Hicks, that was the name of the artist, he was painting in the kind of early 19th century. and he was a Quaker preacher, but he also had this artistic talent. And eventually, he decided he was more of an artist than a preacher. So
he's a very good artist.
Yes, very good.
Yeah.
And so he began painting different scenes. Most of them are pastoral, but a lot of them have these sort of images of peace and cooperation, like this one does.
Right.
And he had a cousin who was also, he was a Hicks as well, and the cousin led one of the schisms within the Quaker sect.
So I'm looking at the Peaceable Kingdom. It might actually be a representation of a Quaker meeting, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I'll never be able to look at that again in
Yeah,
quite
right.
the same way.
Yeah.
So the doctrine of the inner light, this idea that everybody has a divine within, you said leads to ideas of equality. And some of your research kind of directs thinking in that direction, so that the women, you would think, would have a different role perhaps in Quaker society than in other religious societies of the time.
Right. So yeah. So that same equality then needs to play out within the way that the Quakers organize themselves. And so they established what I said were these meetings. So think about those as congregations, and then within the congregation, they would have sort of weekly meetings for the practice of the religious faith. But then they would also have during the week business meetings, and these were meetings to get the business of the group organized. So that might mean one of the things that the meeting did was to make sure that the marriages that were going to happen within that group were okay, or that the people who were coming had moved to that group were upstanding people. They weren't people that were dead, that they had debt or that they were running away from something.
Right.
So the way they would arrange this is that they had a group of men, a men's meeting, and then a group of women, a women's meeting. And the women were responsible for some things, and the men were responsible for others. And so they had these separate meetings. They kept minutes. The women were responsible for going out and visiting, say, a woman who was about to marry another Quaker, or in a case sometimes when women married what they said was outside the faith. So they, say they were going to marry a Methodist or somebody, a Baptist. These women would go and visit the young woman who was thinking about marrying, and they would counsel her about whether this was a good idea or not.
So women in these, these are pretty important leadership roles.
Very important.
And maybe we can see this next image here, I think, of a woman speaking to a Quaker meeting setting here.
Yeah.
You might say something about this.
So as early as the 17th century, when the Quakers are first operating, women are very much a part of the people who spoke out more often in meeting, and so they would be acknowledged as women ministers or men ministers, and not in the same way that we think of probably a typical Protestant minister,
right.
but somebody who more often than not had the sort of the inner light come out and they would talk.
And they did have certain authority in that.
And they did.
Role as well.
Sometimes they would talk about certain rules or guidelines that fellowship needed to follow, and so women from the very beginning were part of that. And for the 17th century to have women speak in church would have been very radical. Right. And thinking about if people were following the gospel of and Paul, and where there's no women are not to speak in church, then this was really anathema to that, and that's one of the reasons that people were persecuted was for these things. And so women were very much from the very beginning part of that. So
you've got then the Quaker communities are challenging established authority structures everywhere they go, in every direction, and then bringing women into positions like that, empowering them. And it's all based on, what's fascinating to me is, it's all based on this theological principle
right.
of equality, based on the idea that all people are, I guess, have part of the divine within them.
Correct, yeah. And so going back to, the earliest days, kind of to the early Christ and his ideas, and really not having it filtered through anything, including really the text.
But the women in these communities played a substantial role in defining what the community would look like, who was and was not a legitimate member of the community. So that's pretty
absolutely
important.
And I think women, as much as the church was equal, or the Quakers were equal, there were also times when women, ran up against opposition even within the equality of the Quakers.
Right.
So I think one example of that is when a young woman was going to marry somebody who was not a Quaker. They had a harder, one thing they could do is they could apologize to the meeting, to the whole group of people and say, I'm sorry, I'd made this mistake. And sometimes they were forgiven and allowed to stay in the meeting. Men particularly were forgiven. Women were less forgiven. And I think one of the reasons that was, men could oftentimes convince their spouse that had maybe been a Methodist to convert to Quakerism. Women, I think, had a little harder time. The evidence shows that the men didn't tend to want to convert. And so oftentimes the women were disowned, is what it was known as. And it didn't mean that they were, it's different than being shunned, as say the Amish do. It was disownment meant that they were no longer allowed to participate in business of the meeting, but they could come to worship, and they still continue to live in the community. So it was bad, but not devastating.
But in practice, it may not always have been quite as equal.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I assume, since you've got a situation where women can rankle feathers, there was situations where people were disowned and perhaps persecuted. And we have an image here of a statue, a fairly famous statue. I believe you said it's on the Boston Commons, of Mary Dyer.
Mary Dyer, yeah. So early on, the Quakers were very much evangelists. And so Quakers would come over from England and they traveled all over the American colonies. Early on, 3 women went to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, not long after the Puritans had gotten there, and began to evangelize about Quaker teachings. And of course, this was just seen as a terrible thing amongst the Puritans of New England. And so this was such a problem, and they saw it as such a antagonism that they eventually arrested her, and then she was hung. One of the women that was that was hung and killed, and then her statue then is in Boston as recognition of that. And to be a martyr like that, it was really a big part of sort of what the Quakers. Instead of saying we're not going to do it anymore, they just sent more people over and continued to evangelize.
Puritans were pretty much equal opportunity victimizers.
That's true.
So what was her particular crime? What were the charges that were brought against her?
Well, I think speaking against the text, speaking about equality, being a woman, speaking about religion. Those were all pretty bad things to do at that time.
Overstepping her bounds.
Absolutely, yeah. In the same way that witches, women, witches were also persecuted for those things.
So now your research, which focuses on women, but was focused on a particular geographical area as well, and I think that was Pennsylvania and down through the Appalachian Mountains, perhaps. Is there anything in particular about that region that stands out to you as you think about the way Puritans came to this country and then affected the religious landscape?
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm looking at, I was very interested in looking at migration after the American Revolution. And the reason I chose Quakers to study was really because they were great record keepers. And you can track them across time and place because they had to move from, say, Philadelphia out to counties that were near Pittsburgh. They had to have a certificate of removal. And those certificates were issued by the meeting that they were leaving. And it would say, this family is clear of debt. There have been outstanding Quakers in our meeting, and we recommend them highly to your meeting. And that way, the meeting out west, who might not know those people at all, right, because they were not acquainted with them, could take the word of the meeting they were coming from and say, oh, these people are good. We want them in our community. We think they'll be good people for us. And so that's how I got interested in it. I was able to find these removal certificates, and I could follow people. And so once they got out west, west as in the Appalachian, they met up with Quakers from all over. So there were Quakers coming from North Carolina and Quakers coming from New Jersey and Pennsylvania, from Virginia, and they all ended up in this area just south of Pittsburgh in 2 counties really out there. And they had to figure out how to all get along. And because you'd think a Quaker in North Carolina is the same as a Quaker in Virginia, but it turned out that over time there had been differences in how they were applying what they called the discipline, which is the kind of the rules of how to be a Quaker. The
rules of morality and ethics?
Exactly.
Okay.
So, so they got there and they had to kind of figure that out. So, for example, some Quakers were coming from the area of North Carolina down by the ocean, so in Carteret County, for example. those folks had not abolished slavery by the time that they moved. In fact, really, some of them brought their slaves with them.
Well, that in itself is fascinating because, I mean, I always thought of Quakers as being pro-abolitionist, and that their theology would encourage them to be anti-slavery.
And I think that they do, by the middle of the 18th century, they're some of the earliest people to argue against slavery. But it takes a while for everybody to come on board. And, I think you see inconsistencies in a lot of ways, whether it's politics or religion, right? And so for some groups, in Pennsylvania, they were very much on the abolitionists pretty early on. But in other areas, it took a while, and partly because of the customs of where they were living and the culture. So when they all get out there to Western Pennsylvania, they've got a lot of conflict in some ways because they've got to figure out how all these Quakers have to kind of homogenize in some ways.
I bet these certificates of removal, I mean, that's fascinating. That must be a historian's dream.
It is.
You really, I mean, you get a view into the personal lives of these folks, I would imagine.
Although they're a little pithy when they write them. So, you have to, some historians call it close reading. So you read these in a way that you really look at every word. And what you notice if you read a lot of them, and sometimes they say these were excellent meeting members, and sometimes it says they were good meeting members, and sometimes they say, they occasionally came to meetings. So you get a sense of sort of who these people were, and then that really told the people where they were moving, kind of what they were getting.
That's fun.
Yeah.
Now, so I guess the North Carolina Quakers then come down from Pittsburgh or this area down through the Appalachians? Is that how they got into
Well, yes, some of them did. So there were, the one group actually were people that were in Perquimans and Pasquotank up by the Albemarle Sound. They were originally converted to Quakerism by a visit from Fox early on in the early, sort of late 17th century.
So a direct North Carolina connection to the founder.
So they were one of the earliest communities of Quakers. And then there's a group, the one that's down east near, sort of Beaufort, where the Quakers from Rhode Island, they came down to be boat builders. Then the largest group of Quakers came down to where we know as Guilford County. And
we have an image here to show.
Oh, okay, good.
I think from Guilford County, I guess it's the New Garden Quaker Meeting House.
So those folks are the ones that came down what we call it was the Wagon Road, but it's Interstate 81 now, right?
Oh,
so they came down from Pennsylvania and settled in that central Piedmont area around Guilford, and then founded Guilford College in the mid-19th century as a Quaker college. But that was a very strong meeting, and the picture we have is of the yearly meeting house. And so a yearly meeting was when all the meetings throughout North Carolina would come together, and they would send representatives to this yearly meeting. And this was a gathering where it was both business and spiritual, and also just a good time to see all these people that you might never run into, right? It was a party for Quakers.
Which is often the case, I think, on the frontier. You have religious conferences, revival meetings, camp meetings in the South.
Exactly.
Yeah. So today, Quaker communities, Society of Friends, they still continue to be, I think, associated with progressive causes, at least in the world of religion. Is that a holdover from their heritage and legacy, and still kind of connected to the theology? And I guess I'm asking, what are some of the favorite Quaker causes, if you will?
Right. So, right after the First World War, there was an organization that was founded really to promote peace throughout the world, and that was led by the Quakers, and that still continues today. And then I think, in the 19th century until today, women were very much involved in women's equality movement and feminist movements. And so I think there's 15% of those who signed on at the Seneca Falls Women's Conference in the 1840s were Quaker women. And you saw them very involved in the women's rights movement, or women's voting movement. And then, I think today also, so anti-war, peace, and then I think women, or men and women who are interested in Quakerism and they might convert to that, are people who are interested in equality, so social justice issues, poverty, those kinds of things. I think tend to be still important issues for Quakers.
Are Friends still seen to be sort of, I guess, outside the mainstream or anti-establishment?
Yeah, so there's a kind of a break in the 19th century where the Quakers that moved west of the Appalachians to the Midwest and later to the West started to have their services be what they called programmed services. So they became much more like any other Protestant church. So they had, the whole
sort of acculturation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But kept their, I think, the theology remained the same, but was more, I guess, became more mainstream to Protestantism. But if you go to a meeting, there's like in Guilford at New Garden, they'll have a program meeting and they'll have a silent meeting as well. And so those still remain. And near Philadelphia, you still have those kind of silent meetings.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, have you been to a Quaker meeting?
Uh-huh.
Have you ever been to a Quaker meeting where nobody said anything, just as a kind of a parting shot here?
Yeah, I've been to both, and when I was doing the research, I used to have dreams where, because the earliest Quakers, where they got their name Quaker, was that in the very early days that when they were meeting, people would be so moved by the Spirit that they would speak in tongues and quake and things like that, and so I always worried that I'd be in a meeting and started finding myself doing that. Yeah.
Well, this has been very interesting. You're a fascinating guest, and I want to learn more about the Society of Friends.
Yeah.
And maybe have to have you back again.
Okay.
Sometime. Thank you very much.
All right.
Well, that's Religion and Life for this week. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions, please contact us at watchapptv.com. Until next time, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt.